I don't know that I have terribly much to say. I've been conversing with Willow for some time now, which has been really a lovely exercise. So I'm just so pleased to have made her acquaintance, and I'm really, have been fascinated by this idea of citizens' assemblies as well as people's assemblies. So I'm really interested to hear you both speak today. So over to you. Would you like to start, Sonia? And
I think Willow's going to go first, aren't you, Willow?
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, so Sonia and I are sort of working with Extinction Rebellion, but as externally facing coordinators in Melbourne, and we met through Extinction Rebellion, and so I spent most of the year sort of in research trying to understand how citizen assemblies work, and I'll let Sonia explain more about that to you all. But I along the way discovered this People's Assembly model that is really interesting because it can be a grassroots approach to democratic renewal, where citizens' assembly is a much more legitimate and weighted process. But the two things, I think, can work together in a really interesting way that hasn't necessarily been considered before. So basic premise is that a People's Assembly is just really good meeting practice. The really healthy meeting practices. You're probably doing it naturally anyway. A lot of teachers are doing it naturally. A lot of organisations are doing it naturally. But there's just some more sort of frameworks around how to do them in public spaces or within organisations or in an organised sense, and a very planned sense. They can become a really healthy way to help join local people up with their communities and with their local councils to create new outcomes. And then the main findings for citizen assemblies and people's assemblies is basically that when regular citizens, just like us, have the mandate, the time and the information to decide on very complicated issues, they can overcome their differences and develop sensible solutions. So when you have really well facilitated assemblies of any kind, you can have very surprising outcomes where people can cross the divide of opinions or political sort of ideologies and beliefs to come to common ground for the common good. So they're not new. They've been used a lot in uprisings before, for the Arab Spring, for Occupy. They're embedding them. They're sort of at the heart of Extinction Rebellion's practices, and Melbourne's getting better at doing that too. So it's sort of a bit of a learning process for a lot of people as well. They borrow from ideas like a World Cafe, open space technology, and then deep democracy as well. The basic things you might have started to learn about, and there's like half a dozen hand gestures that you use. So you've got a point to make, a technical point, everyone agrees, clarify a point, a direct response, and then round up, which Nell, you have to tell me when I hit too long. So it's really sort of simple stuff. It's quite fun when you get the hang of it. And so I've started looking at, with Sonia and some other co-founders, this sort of creating a platform for how we can use this tool outside of activism. Because I think it's an underutilised tool that hasn't really been thought of in this way yet, that it can be the way that grassroots communities can start to cross the divide and undo some of the democratic disconnect that we have in our system, political system, and yeah, find new outcomes. So sort of working at the moment on activating the tool on a platform and creating a pilot program for how this can work with local councils and for the climate emergency. So I have a plan in place and a theory of change diagram that is not probably going to look great on screen, so I might just talk through it. Let me actually just step back for a second. So three main sort of ingredients that help a people's assembly is this idea of radical inclusivity. So all voices are heard equally and there's no judgment or ridicule. Active listening. So you hear people speak all the way through before you're responding. And there's an idea of trusting the process, because the process is basically the tool for decision making, and that's what will create change. So once decisions are finalised in any kind of people's assembly, participants are more likely to trust the outcome because of experiencing the actual process, and we're calling this democracy in action. So those hand gestures become quite critical in how you can work your way through a facilitated experience for having, you know, difficult conversations that politics as normal just is really struggling to solve. We have a model in place that we're looking to put through our pilot platform program to take the model outside of activist circles and into sort of everyday life, but how to avoid the pitfalls of it just being a hot air conversation that goes nowhere. So to embed feedback loops within that, and to design the program to have outcomes for actions sort of embedded into the planning, even though we don't know what they might be, but also sort of partnering with the right sort of stakeholders. And the main, and council members, and the main vision for what we're trying to do with the tool is to ultimately help increase participation in democracy. We know statistically there's huge disconnect happening, and people are becoming less and less engaged. And then to also help activate and mobilise communities to reach and achieve zero by 2025. And the theory of change that I'm working on at the minute is how we can basically plan people's assemblies for the emergency mode, to also help communities and organisations learn how to adapt the model, and ultimately advocating for citizens' assemblies to become a third chamber. So we're sort of like at this point before citizens' assemblies, because we can see that they're kind of a really, really interesting sticking point that are hopefully going to help us get out of some of the things we're in, some of the situations we're in. And I'll let Sonia talk to you more about all of that. But that's our sort of main goal, is that by actually participating in people's assemblies, you understand them and you learn democracy in action. You feel empowered as an individual. You feel more connected to your community, and you feel like you can actually, you have a voice and your voice counts, and that you might understand then. It's sort of like a preceding approach almost, to say, this is how citizens' assemblies work without sortition, to help communications around it and help just sort of general buy-in and sort of a mass advocacy within this plan. And then, of course, the frameworks can be applied to any of the other big problems too, like why we still need a Charter for Human Rights in Australia and other important things like that. Yeah, so any questions? I think we're going to do some at the end. And meanwhile, I'll hand over to Sonia.
Fantastic. Thank you, Willow. So go ahead, Sonia, and we'll pick up questions for Willow at the end.
Okay, great. That gives me a couple of minutes extra, so I'm pleased about that because I've got a lot to say. So a citizens' assembly is much like a people's assembly, but it's more institutionalized. So one of the key differences, and probably the key difference, is the process by which participants are chosen. And it's a little bit like jury selection. So you have a random selection of, say, 100 people, however big the citizens' assemblies are. And they've ranged from, say, an average size, I think, from my research, looks to be about 100 people. But there's been ones in Porto Alegre that have all together included 20,000 people, because they held small ones, which fed up to a bigger one, which, small ones which fed up to a sort of increasing pyramid process. So they can encompass a huge number of people that participate in them, or it can be a smaller number. But one of the key things about those people who are randomly chosen is that they have to be demographically representative. So, for example, that can be in terms of gender, it can be in terms of age, it can be in terms of income, and importantly, they try to get them across the political spectrum. So, for example, there was a select committee hearing earlier this week in the UK Parliament about a Brexit citizens' assembly, because they've been having a couple of problems finding any sort of solutions to that. And what that would mean is that of the people that come into the room, at least half of them would have voted leave in the referendum that was held. And so they would reflect the general spread of public opinion on Brexit as they come into the room. So that's one key difference, is that it's not just the people who choose to walk into the room, it's that they're randomly selected. So that means that there's a process of persuading the people, making them feel important is generally how it seems to work, to turn up to the Citizens' Assembly. It's like you are being asked to represent your community and represent your political opinion within this Citizens' Assembly. That the recommendations that you make and the people that you're with make will be fed into the legislative process in some way, shape or form. So one thing is the sortition. This in turn feeds into the increased legitimacy that citizens' assemblies have in comparison to people's assemblies. One of the criticisms of a lot of political processes is that they only engage people who are already to some extent engaged. That they tend to be people who have more money because they're the people who are more likely to have time to engage and to educate themselves and get involved in political processes. That they tend to be urban-centric. They tend to be, so it's the same old usual suspects. That's the phrase I'm searching for. That always end up in the rooms and that are making the decisions, or people that look very much like the usual suspects. So because it's that demographically representative sample, it has greater legitimacy. And the third thing that's really important is that in turn gives it a greater mandate. So for example, in the one that I was referring to just now in Porto Alegre, even though, and I don't think this is best practice, certainly not for what we want to see here, but they don't have any actual institutional power to get the mayor of Porto Alegre to follow the recommendations that come out of the Citizens' Assembly, which is specifically on the budget. As yet, the mayor hasn't yet ignored that, because it's a representative process, and the strength of legitimacy that those recommendations have has meant that the mayor has always taken on those budgeting recommendations. So that's one example of the way in which the mandate works. I've been thinking about the factors in success, and I think there are 60 factors in the success of a good citizens' assembly. The first one is the process. It has to be not just above party politics, but seen to be above party politics. And one of the key factors in that is the appointment of a chair who is seen as to be independent. So, for example, the Irish process, which is probably one of the most often cited ones, that it was a former High Court judge who was seen to be neutral on the issues that are up for debate, and also well respected by all sides of the political spectrum. So you need to have somebody who's driving the process, who's seen to be, say, above party politics. That also helps in terms of ensuring what the criteria are for representation. Because as you can see, that's going to be a fairly sticky, it can be a sticking point. For example, what sort of proportion of the representatives should be Indigenous people, especially if there is an area that doesn't have a huge Indigenous population? I would personally argue that we should always have Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander representation in the room whenever we're making decisions about things. But you can see that there might be other demographic criteria which might be a little bit tricky. So you need to have somebody who can make those tough decisions on who should be, on what demographic criteria will count for the Citizens' Assembly and what demographic criteria won't. So the issue of representation. The third one is the facilitation within the process, which Willow talked about quite a bit, but it has to be a very well facilitated process for its work. There have to be people who can make sure that the hand signals are respected, that nobody feels intimidated or that their voice isn't going to be heard. And so one of the ways that's done is that you break things down into small groups. You make sure that everyone is given that time to talk, and then that feeds up into the plenary. Recommendations from small groups feed up into a plenary, and recommendations are then voted upon. The fourth thing I think I'm on that I think is important is the mandate. And we've seen this with particularly, again, the Irish Citizens' Assembly. So the first what's happened in Ireland is that 100 people have been chosen to sit and discuss and debate and come up with recommendations on 6 major issues in a process that's been going on since 2016. And it's the same 100 people in theory who are supposed to be meeting now to talk about the climate emergency. Obviously, that's really taxing on those individuals who are involved. And it turns out that there's only a handful of people who sat in the abortion one that are still involved in the climate emergency one, because it just is a really, I mean, I say it's been 3 years and meeting almost every weekend for that time. But one of the key problems with the first one was that the Parliament, and I can never remember the name of the Irish Parliament, sorry, thought that the recommendations that came out of the Citizens' Assembly did not reflect the opinions of the majority of the Irish people, and they were too liberal, despite the demographic representativeness of the Citizens' Assembly. However, when it went to referendum, the vote at referendum almost exactly mirrored that of the Citizens' Assembly. So I think it slightly undermined the process that the legislature didn't take the Citizens' Assembly seriously enough, and there wasn't a mechanism to ensure prior to the discussions and debates that they did actually act upon the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. So the mandate, these two are sort of linked together, is the publicity and the framing. In British Columbia, they've run Citizens' Assemblies, but they haven't been very successful because people didn't understand the process. And so where you find people are educated and the wider public are educated about the process and about what's going on, then you get results similar to the one in Ireland. But when people don't understand the process and don't understand the process of deliberation that led to the recommendations, in British Columbia, they set a very high standard. It had to be 60% of the population voted in favor of the recommendations, and they only got 58% of the population voting in favor of the recommendations. And so the recommendations were rejected. But there wasn't publicity around the Citizens' Assembly. And so that, again, undermined the efforts that went on there. One of the concerns was that has been raised is that you can have, particularly with the climate emergency, that it can be skewed to reflect the false balance, particularly in terms of the experts that have chosen to address the Citizens' Assembly. Now, in Ireland, what they had was on the abortion debate and discussion, they had 5 experts come. Now, the experts were chosen by the independent chair. So one key factor there is the respect of the independent chair. If everybody respects and admires and sees the independent chair as being above party politics, then the chances of there being an imbalance in terms of the experts is less likely to occur. But I think that's the key factor there. In Ireland, the people that were chosen was one medical lawyer, 2 constitutional lawyers, and 2 obstetricians. And they got 13,000 submissions from the general public, which these 100 people had to sift through, and did a pretty amazing job by all accounts of it. And I think the other thing is that the balance comes in the participants more than the experts. That if there's that balance among the participants, they can sift through that information and work through it. Okay, so just rounding up, I've talked about 2 of the 3 case studies that I wanted to discuss. I've talked a bit about Ireland. I've talked a bit about British Columbia. The British Columbia one, just so that got a bit of background, that was on reform of the democratic process, the reform of the electoral process that they had their citizens' assembly on. The third one I just want to very briefly talk about is, there's been one recently in Camden, and that hasn't worked very well. It was by the Camden Local Council in London. And one of the reasons it didn't work very well is because it wasn't seen as being above the party political process. And for anything to do with the climate emergency, I think we're going to have to be really, really careful to make sure that there is an independent chair, that there are independent facilitators, and that it's seen to be above, that the people who are running it are not seen to be invested in the issue. Last thing I'd just like to say is there is a really great website, which I only discovered yesterday, and which I highly recommend that people take a look at if they want to dive deeper into this issue. And it's called Participedia, which is a bit like Wikipedia, but Participedia. And it has hundreds of case studies. I've only looked at 2 so far. So I really recommend that if you really want to dive deeply into this, that's a good place to go. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Sonia and Willow. That was a real kind of tour of all of the big stuff there. Thank you so much. I wonder, so we've got a bit of time now for questions. I wonder if I can just kick it off with something that I've been wondering, which is, I guess I've been observing that, you know, perhaps the left has been kind of grabbing on, this is my perception, grabbing on to these as a way, you know, seeing, oh, it can make, you know, sort of somewhere like Ireland move unexpectedly towards more progressive policies. Do you think that that's a kind of concern, that basically the right will just sort of be reflexively kind of rejecting this as a possibility, or do you think that there's any way to kind of make that not the case?
Okay.
It's a really good question, and I think that as more and more case studies around the world build, and as more and more people use them, I think the whole for people's assemblies where it's everyone's invited, it's really good that we have that cross-demographic by participation to help spread stories as a pre-communication, stories that can travel type experience to help seed for citizens' assemblies. But as well, like there's a thing in this deep democracy workshop I just did last week where the facilitators called it you spread the no. So if somebody has an opinion on the other side of the group, of say there's 8 to 10 people in the group, and one person's obviously on the far left and another person's coming from the far right, you spread that so that everybody's okay with it and going, oh, that's actually fine. I can have a different view, but we still need to reach a middle common ground because of the science. I don't know if that really answers what you... That's just sort of my take on what I hope will be enough change to bubble up and along and across and to share positive outcomes to difficult things, so that it becomes less about my view and more about what do we need to do for an emergency status.
I think that the other thing is that a lot of the times that citizens assemblies are being held at the moment and in the past few years have been at times of crises, not necessarily driven by the left. So, for example, the Brexit discussions on a citizens' assembly are very much being driven by the Tory party in the UK, because they are terrified. They have no idea what to do at the moment in terms of actually delivering what they have promised. And so they're seeing this as a potential way out. And it was to some extent the same in British Columbia as well. The problem there was that they kept on having a party would get a huge majority and then they'd only have 2 seats in the next parliament. And so there was these massive swings happening within the legislature, and they felt that it showed that the electoral system was failing and they wanted to find a way out of it. And so they needed things that were above party politics. So I don't think I think we're getting more case studies that are coming from both sides of the political spectrum. I think the second point I'd like to make is that the right often talks about their legitimacy, particularly, I mean, at the moment, as coming from reflecting the will of the people, and that those on the left are all just urbanites and the people who are a particular class, and again, that more politically active kind of thing, and they're not talking for the silent majority. So if the right's going to use that kind of rhetoric to bolster their own legitimacy, it's hard to see how they can do both things at once. You can't say we won't listen to the voice of the people if we've got citizens' assemblies that are talking very clearly about what needs to be done. So I think that the popular mandate rhetoric that's often used can also be turned to advocate for a citizens' assembly and for following the results of a citizens' assembly.
Beautiful, thank you. So I'd just like to open it now for other questions. Does anyone have any more? Go ahead, Peter. Still can't hear you. No, I still can't hear you.
Yeah, so one question I have is because politicians, often politicians are in politics for power, and a citizens' assembly actually takes some power away from them. What's the reason why politicians would actually agree with having a citizens' assembly?
That one's you, Sonia.
Okay, well, as I say, the reason why they're doing it at the moment in various countries across, the UK one is, I think, a classic example. They're doing it because they don't know what to do. It was pretty much the same in Ireland as well. The reason why they decided it was a minority government that was the one that promised that if they came to power, they would institute this process of citizens' assemblies. So at the moment, what we're seeing is it's often at times of crisis where the ruling parties recognize that that there is a sort of lacuna in their mandate, and that's why they're calling for citizens' assemblies to try and bolster their mandate for action. I'm not quite sure what drove. Belgium has instituted a citizens' assembly as a chamber for lawmaking. And I'm afraid I don't know exactly what drove that decision. Perhaps Willow knows a bit more about that. But I would be interested to know why they decided that they needed a permanent chamber that was constituted by a citizens' assembly, because I think that'll be a really interesting one to follow up on.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I actually didn't read why they got there. I just read that they got there and went, ha ha, that's fantastic. I think it's happening now. New Democracy here is working with them in Sydney, in Australia. And it's an incredible social experiment. How they got there, I'm not super sure. Yeah.
And I think that the other thing is that there's been quite a number of surveys which have shown that when you ask people, do you believe in democracy? People say yes. Are you happy with the way that democracy is working? People say no. And so there is this, this goes back to when I was an undergraduate in the early 1990s. There was a talk about the ways in which there was a sort of democratic deficit in the political system. And that's why there were new social movements coming up and things like that. And I think it's worsened since then. So the issue of that politics recognize that there is a democratic deficit and be trying to act to do that. I'm not saying that that's going to happen with all politicians, but maybe there are some that are doing it for those reasons.
Go ahead, Dal. We can't hear you yet. Still can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, okay. You mentioned the Irish Citizens Assembly meeting on the weekend. I was just wondering, when, so are they compensated, and in what way are they compensated, and what's the time commitment, and how does it work exactly? Because that sounds as if it would be like jury duty, but really terrible.
but on weekends.
I think there are two things. That yes, there is compensation, because otherwise you end up with the same sort of issues as you get of the usual suspects in part, those who can afford to spend a weekend at this. So it is compensated. What has been found is that people do make a real effort to turn up to these things because it is empowering and they feel like they're learning a lot and they are actually contributing. So, for example, there was and this was actually just an informal process in some ways. There was a Brexit Citizens Assembly that was convened by an academic institution. So it didn't have any official mandate or official legitimacy. It was still done by sortition. They randomly selected people, and they found that, first of all, people, there was only one person that didn't turn up for the second weekend. It was held over 2 weekends, and they were compensated, but not wonderfully well. And that person had major health issues going on in their family. It wasn't that they just didn't feel like turning up. And the second thing that they mentioned was that the people who had been involved in the Citizens Assembly on Brexit, even though it wasn't official and it didn't have any mandate to get action things, they tracked in the media how far politicians were acting in accordance with the recommendations that came out from the Citizens Assembly, and were writing to the researchers to tell them, this happened and that wasn't what we said, or this happened and that was what we said, kind of idea. So I think that, yes, jury duty might not be wonderfully well compensated. This probably wouldn't be wonderfully well compensated either. But there are compensations that are not monetary that seem to come out of it as well. As yet, looking through a lot of material on this, there hasn't been a huge amount, there hasn't been actually anything there that says this was a bad experience for anyone. Who attend them tend to really want to keep attending them. And in the Irish case, I mean, it has been going on for 3 years, and that's why there's been the turnover. But the people who were coming out of the first one on abortion, which lasted 5 months, and it was 1 or 2 weekends a month that they were attending, when they were coming out of it, were all saying, we feel so much better informed on this, we're more interested in it, we feel like we're making a real difference. And that was the key motivating factor to keep coming back.
I think as well, what often happens is people at the end of them become an ambassador for the issue. So it's, even if you're only informing a certain number of people in your society, it just helps create a whole lot of advocacy for the issue and the processes.
So I think we might have time for one more question. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, look, I wonder about the role of the media in Australia on something like this. And you mentioned, I think in British Columbia, that there wasn't good publicity and that led to public not really appreciating what was going on, which undermines the process. And I mean, there's certainly interests in Australia that are not really in favour of participatory processes, and some of them, you know, have puppets in Canberra who do their bidding. So how do you think we can get the media and those kinds of vested interests at the table on something like this? I'll mention that in Western Australia, Dialogue with the City, which was the West Australian government-led participatory process, actually did get the West Australian on board. So the West Australian was part of the team, so to speak.
The British Columbia thing, the problem wasn't so much that it got bad media, it was that they didn't get any media, and they didn't seem to have a media strategy at all going in, because they didn't understand or recognise the importance of media. I'm actually a former journalist myself, so I fully understand the issues that are involved in trying to get media coverage of something like this. But I think that there are a couple of things that help. I mean, obviously, it's really important to have a good media strategy at the outset and to make sure. I think that the other thing is that it helps the media to focus on issues rather than on personalities when you have a citizens' assembly process, because you don't have that party political dogfight wwhere it's two sides of an issue, and you've got to have the ALP side and the coalition side both represented as opposed to each other. And therefore, with complex issues like climate crisis, like Brexit, it becomes really, the nuance gets lost. Whereas when you don't have that party political dogfight dominating the process, it becomes easier for the media to focus on the issue itself. So, Willa, did you?
Yeah, I think as well there was, in South Australia, there was a really successful citizens' assembly that became a bit of a case study for the rest of the world. I think it was 2011, but I could be wrong, for the a nuclear dump being put into the state. And the government who partnered with it, I think, I could be getting some of this information wrong, I think we're wanting it to happen, but they put it to a citizens' assembly, and the citizens' assembly said, no, we don't want this in our state. And it didn't happen. And that became a really successful story in the media as well. And it's spread, you know, it's in the world information. So I think creating lots and lots of case studies at grassroots level and at an official level, and trying to work with the right kind of, not the right kind, but with friendly journalists to at least start storytelling, and then through social media, just that anybody can be sharing. I think it's like a bit of a long game I'm looking at, which is we're going to start small and get it big, and just, you know, try and build the change with lots of positive stories that will eventually become unstoppable, hopefully.
The feedback from people who participated who were anti-nuke is that it was a fairly manipulated process in South Australia.
Okay.
So that while I'm you know, sitting on the fence on that, because I didn't participate, and I thought that it was good that the government at least tried to trial that kind of process in South Australia. So you know, it's a project I was very hopeful for, and I think there is hope, but there are people who are in it who bag it. So there you go.
Okay. So I actually wanted to check in with Rod, whether we are planning to have any more kind of chat for CCL stuff. Sorry, everybody, I wasn't really meant to be emceeing before an hour ago. So do we have more kind of like CCL stuff to talk about after this, or should I make time for another question or two? What do you think?
Well, I've only got less than 5 minutes things to say, so we could probably have another question if you like.
Have we got one last question from anyone? I've actually got one if nobody else does. But are you unmuting, Howard, for that reason?
Yeah, I think I'd like to back up what Jim was saying. Sophia was saying that it gives the media an opportunity to focus on the issues, but I don't think our media wants to focus on the issues. They're quite happy with the status quo. They're quite happy with having an anti-climate change agenda, and they don't want to focus on the issues. So I think we've got a problem here because the papers, the establishment don't accept there's a crisis, and so they're not ready to do anything.
I completely agree. But I guess what I should say is that they don't have personalities to focus on in a citizens' assembly. That if it's a process which has broad public appeal, then it's really hard for media to ignore it if there's that publicity going on around it as well. So that's why I think a good media strategy, publicity within the community, that would make it hard for the media to ignore it, especially because we do at least still have a public broadcaster here that would pick up on the issues, especially the local media ones, which again makes it harder for the Murdoch press, who are certainly not friendly and certainly would much rather a dogfight to cover it. So we do have to recognize the hostility that is there, say particularly amongst the Murdoch press and related stations. But I think that we're far more likely to get coverage of the issues through a process like this, as long as it's handled, as say, that there needs to be that media strategy and that there needs to be broad-based public awareness and support from the outset to get things rolling.
Do you have anything to add to that, Willie?
Yeah, I agree. It's a really sticky one, because our mainstream media is potentially compromised, and we're being, led by this idea that, the surveillance state is growing and fear is being weaponized. And I think all we can do is try the opposite. That's not actually an answer, but I suppose it's like trying to come down to help people realize that we just need to trust each other, and to trust the people will come up with good answers to really difficult questions that democratic. Up here we've got these decisions being made that nobody's trusting, and then not necessarily for our best long-term interests. And it's up to us. We have to try and bring that back. How the media responds, I think Sonia's right. We have to have some media partnerships and strategy in place for how to kind of create good, positive stories and help them get aired and shared in the right way. And kind of there'll be trolls and people out there just trying to bring it down, and that's just going to be put aside somehow. Yeah. It might also be a good problem to have, because that means then it's working.
And one more thing, the other issue in British Columbia is that they set these really high standards for it to succeed. They had to have 60% of the localities. There were 77 localities. I'm not sure, that's not the right word, but districts that were going to be affected by the change across the state. And 75 of the 77 participated. They needed to have 60% of those of voters approving the changes that were recommended by the Citizens' Assembly. And as I say, 58% agreed with the recommended changes. They found that among the people that were aware of the Citizens' Assembly process, 66% supported the recommendations that came out of it. But there were enough people that weren't aware that did vote that weren't. So I think it was a twofold problem. The media led to people not supporting the recommendations, but also they started off with this impossibly high or extremely high referendum level, if you see what I mean. So I think that to get 60% of the vote was also a pretty high hurdle for them to have to jump over as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sonia and Willow, for bringing your time and your energy and your expertise today. And yeah, we hope to hear more from you with your platform, Willow, and your, interesting things coming out. We really appreciate you having you here today on our call. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having us. And also, I forgot to say thank you for the lovely intro, and lovely to meet you all. Hopefully we get to cross paths, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yeah,
what she said. Thank you.
I think we'll hop off now and leave you to finish your meeting, I suppose. So.
Oh yeah, should we give them the appreciation?
Good luck.
Thank you very much, Nell, for facilitating that part, but also my special thanks to Sonia and Willow, because what you had to share with us is really, really important, and reclaiming democracy is part of what Citizens Climate Lobby is about, and you've given us some more information and some more ideas about how to do that, so very much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
You're welcome to stay for the next 5 minutes if you wish, but otherwise, okay, so hi CCL. Just a couple of things to finish off that in terms of thinking about our actions for the month. Clearly, we're running up to the conference now, where in 5 weeks' time we'll be in Canberra together. Some of us will be in Canberra together, having our conference and preparing for our lobby days. So anything you can do to get yourself there and to get other members of your group there would be really, really important. But also think about can you bring a friend if you're coming yourself? Encourage other people to come. And those who've been to the conference before, the feedback is always, wow, what an amazing experience, and how good it is to be walking through the halls of Parliament and letting members of Parliament know what it's about. Also, a key what we need to be doing in the next month or two is welcoming new members to Citizens Climate Lobby and putting our hands up to find ways to mentor them to be part of the process of bringing them in. So let your group leaders know that you're available to welcome new members that are coming into your area. And also, as always, keep the letters coming, the letters to the editor. We had a fantastic letter come through. I think I can't show it to you, but a letter to the West Australian yesterday from a man in Albany, the town next to me. He was responding to some criticism in the paper about Extinction Rebellion being extreme, and he answered by saying, no, Extinction Rebellion are asking for rational, sensible things. It's the governments who are opposing us, who are opposing that sort of action, who are the extreme. They're the ones that are taking the extreme position. Very, very well argued. Beautiful little letter. So we'll be building on that in the West, and obviously the more powerful letters to the editor we can be getting through all over the country is going to make a difference. So, and of course, letters to our members of Parliament are also important. And we won't be meeting we won't be meeting in a month's time from now because that'll be too close to the conference. So the next monthly meeting will be the second Saturday of October. So Peter, if you can unmute us so that we can all say goodbye to each other, if you have that power under your control, but otherwise individuals can unmute. And thanks everybody for being with us, and we look forward to seeing some of you in Canberra and the rest of you in 2 months' time in October. Thank you.
Looking forward to seeing you in person.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Great talk. Cheers.
How's the trip going, Tom?
I got to see him a couple of days ago. He popped in. How nice is that?
How's that extension lead
well,
going to your electric car?
It's doing well. We're at Rockhampton now. We arrived